Even now, at the start of the 21st century, for all our advances, we still haven't eliminated the scourge of war.
In fact, the last 100 years have seen war waged on a greater scale than at any other time in human history.
In this new series, my son Dan and I will be examining some of the greatest battles of the 20th century. Battles that have shaped the world we live in today. We'll fly to the Pacific to find out how America turned the tide against Japan. We'll see what remains of the ravaged city of Stalingrad. We'll go to the Far East to visit the battlefields of Vietnam and the front line of the ongoing conflict in Korea, still unresolved to this day. We'll travel to the Falkland Islands, scene of the last war on British territory, and journey to the Middle East to describe battles at the heart of the blighted relationship between Arabs, Israelis, and the Western world.
The 20th century saw the most radical transformation ever in how battles were fought. It witnessed the last cavalry charge and the first nuclear bomb. More people, both military and civilian, were killed in the conflicts of the 20th century than in any other. Throughout this series, I'll be finding out what it was like for the soldiers, sailors and airmen who found themselves fighting often thousands of miles away from home. The enemy is not the only challenge in this dark and difficult terrain.
And I'll be analysing how the commanders devised new strategies to exploit revolutionary advances in technology. Our series begins here in northern France, at the start of the 20th century, with the most destructive war the world had yet seen.
The fighting involved tens of millions of troops from all around the world and led to a greater death toll than any previous war in history.
The First World War, the Great War, established the way that battles are fought to this very day. New weapons like tanks and aircraft were used for the first time with devastating effect.
There was one battle more than any other that harnessed the power of these new weapons to turn the tide of the war. It was fought here in northeast France on the Western Front in 1918. It was the Battle of Amiens.
By the beginning of 1918, Europe's superpowers had fought each other to a standstill on the killing grounds of northern France and Belgium.
A war that had been supposed to last 6 months had dragged on for 3.5 blood-soaked years. When the First World War began, nobody had expected the conflict would turn out the way it did. Germany and her coalition partners, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey, were fighting to secure dominance in Europe and the Middle East.
In the east, they had driven deep into Russia and captured huge swathes of land. And in the west, they'd invaded first Belgium and then France, expecting a quick victory. The British army, including men from Australia, Canada, and other countries of the Empire, had helped the French secure the rest of France, but they had failed to push the Germans out. By 1918, the Allies were still where they had been 3 years earlier, with the British holding the line closest to the Channel ports. The Great War had turned into a deadly stalemate. Battles like Passchendaele, Ypres, the Somme and Verdun, further down the Western Front, had resulted in a catastrophic loss of life on both sides, but the front line had hardly moved.
To break this deadlock, there would have to be a startling change of strategy. Without it, it seemed the war would never end.
The soldiers have been dug in here on the Western Front for the best part of 3 years, and they've been slogging it out in a chain of murderous offensives that seem to them to be pretty futile. Life in these trenches alternated between long periods of mind-numbing boredom and short moments of extreme danger.
There was nothing to be seen, only a line of earth and sandbags with occasional pieces of timber lying about. When you get tired of sitting, you can get up and have a peek between the sandbags. But a man can be in the trenches for a year and never have fired a shot.
The daily routine in the trenches was made infinitely worse by the fact that months of shelling had destroyed the landscape. What had been a countryside of rolling farmland was now one of utter devastation. For the men living and fighting in these dreadful conditions, it must have often seemed like the war was going to go on forever. But thousands of miles away from these trenches, events were now taking place that would bring these men hope that the end of the war was finally in sight.
Throughout the war, there had been a vicious fight for control of the Atlantic shipping lanes. At first, German U-boats only aimed to sink British vessels. By 1917, they made the mistake of targeting supply ships belonging to the United States of America.
For America's President Woodrow Wilson, this was an outrage too far, forcing him to declare war on Germany. After 3 years of watching and waiting, America was now firmly in the fight.
Hundreds of thousands of strong, fresh American troops would soon be arriving in northern France. It was exactly what the exhausted Allied soldiers on the Western Front had been waiting for. With this huge infusion of Americans, the balance of power should shift irreversibly away from the Germans into the Allies' favor.
As we marched through the town, the sidewalks were full of people. We felt so proud and important that such a fuss was being made over us. The French girls would jump in the ranks and throw flowers at us. Of course, we were looking forward to the great adventure ahead of us. We were looking forward to the fight.
From June 1917, the trickle of Americans arriving in France became a flood. But there was a problem with these American troops, nicknamed doughboys. They were raw, inexperienced recruits. Once they arrived in France, they'd need months of training to get them ready for battle. The fact was, the Allies would have to hold the line against the Germans by themselves for a while longer. And if that was bad news, there was worse to come from the war in the East.
Since the beginning of the war, Germany had been locked in battle with Russia on the Eastern Front. But by the beginning of 1918, this had changed dramatically. After seizing power in the Russian Revolution, communists made peace with Germany. With the war in the East at an end, in early